you so much.
As the 2020 presidential race starts picking up in the United States, a number of leading Democrat contenders have made the issue of reparations for slavery a top campaign endorsement. It would entail an official acknowledgement of the legacy of American slavery and compensation payments to those still affected by discrimination as a result.
We have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. And in particular, black people have not. And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up.
I believe it's time to start the national, full-blown conversation about reparations so that we can, as a nation, do what's right and begin to heal.
There are massive disparities that must be addressed. So we're going to do everything we can to put resources into distressed communities and improve lives for those people who have been hurt from the legacy of slavery.
So is it long overdue or misguided? With me now is attorney and author Reese Everson and also social commentator Anthony Brian Logan. Both welcome to RT again. Anthony, first, to point out, as we all well know, much of the Western world was built on slavery, and the legacy of that exploitation is still very much in evidence in the 21st century. Shouldn't reparations be paid as a way of atoning for one of history's worst crimes?
It's a little bit too late for that. We're now in 2019. If they were to be paid, it should have happened right at the end of slavery. 1865, you could have identified the former slave master and the former slave right at that moment, but we're now 150 years past that particular point in time. Who's going to pay it? People that did not have slaves. Nobody alive today in 2019 was a slave back then, so what are we getting paid for? Who's getting paid? Why are they getting paid? It's no more than a campaign promise from Democratic hopefuls trying to get some kind of attention out here.
Reese, is this even workable, this plan?
ABL. Listen, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. First of all, let's define reparations. Reparations is when you have a government repair damages inflicted on a group or people by the government. So if you have the government who allowed people to be enslaved and actually participated in that and made it legalized, then when they repair those people, they provide economic restitution to those people. Now, if I came into your house, Mr. ABL, and I stole $1,000 from you and then I died, or if I stole $1 million from you and then I died, would you say, oh, well, Reese died, so the money doesn't matter anymore? No, you would go talk to my children because my children are still living off the benefits of that $1 million, whether I bought them a new house, whether I paid for their school education. There were benefits that were passed on, and that's what the government owes to people in America that are descendants of slaves. And that is due, and we're ready to cash that check right now.
Anthony, who pays?
I mean, that's my thing, because she's talking about, okay, the government did it back then, but nobody alive today in the government was in the government back when it happened. You're talking about people that are the descendants, but not even the descendants, because most people in this country, especially white people, came after slavery. So what are we really talking about? If I go into government, am I responsible for slavery because I'm in the government now because of what prior governments have done? And if we go by your example of somebody stealing something from somebody, okay, they did it, I didn't do it. Just because somebody's granddad stole something doesn't mean I'm responsible for it. If somebody's granddad was a serial killer and then they found out 100 years later, you don't go after the kids and say, okay, you got to go to jail now, or you got to pay back some money because of what your grandfather did. It makes no sense. You know who did it. You should have been able to catch them while they were alive, punish them while they were alive, and not punish people that have nothing to do with slavery at all. It's absurd.
So even if we still have this great imbalance with among the black communities in the United States, Anthony, who is going to pay for it then? Because there are still white communities that have white privilege and get where they are based on their ethnicity, don't they? Why shouldn't they pay a little towards redressing that balance?
What is white privilege? I think that's
we can't talk. We're not.
Go ahead.
Wait. Okay, So here's the issue. You're conflating two concerns. One is if a person stole money, and two, if a person committed a crime. Yes, there were mass atrocities done during slavery, rape, and just complete, murders and things of that nature. But what we want to focus on is the economic harm that was done to black people. If we really break down what slavery was, people were brought from across the water to work. And that was free labor that translated to, from the estimates of some economists, Dr. Claude Anderson, almost $1.5 to $2 trillion. And so what we have to do now is have the U.S. government say that they are going to study and figure out how to go about repaying that $1.5 to $2 trillion.
So whose fault is that?
That amount of money still can be paid. When you talk about fault, it's the fault of the people who were the government that allowed slavery to. The government had a right to outlaw slavery. It chose not to. Back when Lincoln tried to outlaw it the first time, he freed a few. He freed a few of the slaves, and then guess what he did? The slave owners complained, and then he gave reparations to the slave owners for the economic loss of no longer having slaves working, because when he freed them, the slave owner said, "Oh, well, I paid $25 for this person." So what we're talking about is 360 years of labor, of wages that were stolen from black people, and we need for the black people who are the descendants. We need for the descendants. See, here's what's even better about it, because when you get into it, it's not just slavery, it's Jim Crow, it's redlining, it's reverse redlining, it's the GI Bill that was not that black people were not allowed to participate in. So what we have is generations and years, hundreds of years of systematic discrimination and shutting out of economic access to black people, and that has to be repaid.
Anthony?
That's what reparations is.
Oh, there's a lot there to really address. I mean, you're talking about Jim Crow. Since when did segregation and, bank policies about lending equate to slavery? I don't really understand, but we'll talk about the government thing here for a minute. If we're going to blame the government of the USA, even though nobody is alive wait a minute, even though nobody's alive right now, 2019, that was alive back then, why not talk about the kingdoms over there in Africa, like the Dahomey Kingdom? Their whole empire, their whole kingdom was based on exporting slaves. Let's not forget, we've all learned in school that it was called the slave trade, not the slave kidnap. The slaves are already right there, procured by the Africans to sell to the Arabs first and then to the Europeans. So when we talk about reparations, why not go back to Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, etc., and then tell them, hey, pay us back the money. We're talking about the government of the USA, although nobody is alive that came from that particular point in time. And then we're trying to incorporate other things that just happen to be oppressive, or we feel like they're oppressive. And then the thing about it is, who's going to pay it? You're talking about the government. The government is funded by the people. That means me. That means you will pay for it. So how does it make any sense? Like I said, it would have been more reasonable to have the former slave owner pay the slave when reparations would have been due, which is at the end of slavery, not right now. It makes no sense. This whole argument, it's no logic here.
Let me tell you how many times the U.S. government has repaid people for atrocities or harms done. First, we can start with the slave owners that Lincoln paid in D.C. Then we could start with the money that was taken from the Freedmen Bureau and given back to the slave owners again as reparations to the slave owners. Then we could talk about how the American Indians were given at least $27,000 annually from the Indian Bureau. Then we could talk about how after World War II, we sent over $7 billion from the Marshall Plan to rebuild Italy and Germany. Then we could talk about Japan in the Point 4 plan after we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how we sent money over there. Then we could talk about the Japanese Americans who were given $20,000 for being in the internment camps. And then we could talk about the Puerto Ricans after the Spanish War, the Mexicans after they lost the war to America and and we got New Mexico and things like that. So, and then we can go even further and say that there are people who are being given money in Israel because they live below the poverty line and they're descendants of people who suffered during the Holocaust, which didn't even take place on American soil.
Everybody gets aid. That's not reparations.
Both of you,
you're proving my point.
If I could just both
if we have that much money to help everybody else,
I just want to both ask you, is there a problem?
For the people that we know were harmed on American soil.
Is there a problem with the way that this is just being packaged up, that it's being called reparations for historical wrongs as a way of kind of absolving the guilt of current and living memory governments who have allowed this level of inequality to perpetuate through the United States of America? That if you can dress it up as saying, well, we're paying for something that happened in the past, instead of saying we should be tackling this now. And I'm sorry, but governments who are still alive, people who are still in Congress, haven't done anything about it for decades.
Well, it's wrong to package it like that. Absolutely. Because you're just trying to play on emotions. That's all you're trying to do. You're trying to say reparations because it sounds good on their campaign trail when people get asked, hey, reparations, how about it? Put a microphone on their face, they say, yes, I'm for it. And then that's how we had the conversation now. It's funny how it was never a really big topic under one Barack Obama from 2009 until, 2017 when he was in office. It was never a big topic. Although you have the first black president and the first black family in the White House, a Democrat, and the whole 8 years, never a topic. Now, all of a sudden, because the election's coming up for 2020 to try and defeat Trump with a clown car full of Democrats, 30-something deep, now all of a sudden it's a topic because it's an empty campaign promise.
That's not true at all.
And Miss Everson, back to your point about people getting reparations all over the world, you proved my point. The reparations got paid to those who were able to be identified as deserving it. Right after World War II, right after the whole internment camp thing, right after everything that was going on, they got paid right at that moment. We're talking about 150 years later with people who had nothing to do with it, governments that were not around during slavery. All this talk is trying to run for president. It's empty campaign promises. That's it.
So you're saying that there's no lingering effects of slavery on the lives of African Americans? I mean, that would just be a ridiculous statement. So we're not even going to
not
just
for me.
entertain that.
I can't
but
speak
secondly,
for you.
Let's talk about the fact
not for me.
We can talk about the fact that
I'm
since
successful, so it's not us. So
1989,
who is? I don't know.
that makes you an exceptional person. That does not mean that you're not affected or have lingering effects of
what's the
slavery.
percentage of us that are affected by slavery in a negative way? How many of us can say slavery is the reason why I'm not doing right in the world?
Before we go here, let's clear up something. H.R. 40 was introduced by Congressman John Conyers back in 1989. There's been an annual push by members of Congress to address or even study, because let's go here. Do you realize that H.R. 40 that was introduced by Cory Booker in the Senate is really just a request to have a study on what the effects of slavery are? Because guess what? America's never even studied the effects of slavery on black people. They've never sat down and said, we know that as a government we sanction this experience, but we don't even know how far that experience reaches because no one's ever studied it. How much do we owe black people? No one's ever studied it. Why? Because the government has literally buried its head. It's paid out everybody else and turned its back on the black people in America who have given so much to want to just strive to be a part of this country and with their blood, sweat, and tears.
They paid the money when it was
due,
not hundreds of years later. Whether it's 150 years, that's irrelevant. The point is the effects how long are we going to continue this narrative? 200 years, 300 years, 5,000 years? How long are we going to continue the narrative? At what point do we say we're past slavery?
We're going to stop it now because the buck stops here. Hopefully my generation will stand up and say that the buck stops here so we don't have to go on with this any longer.
Just quickly, both of you, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, I want to ask you, Reese, a few people will find it suspicious that so many Democratic election contenders are going to be jumping on this particular bandwagon to a core voter base that they've taken, let's face it, for granted in previous elections.
Yes.
Absolutely. African American people have been beholden to the Democratic Party, and we've given our vote. We've given our vote. We've given our vote. We came in because there was hope, and we wanted to see change. We wanted to be part of the change, and everyone else's basically their agenda has come before that of black people. When we have to realize that we can't just lump all of the issues of black people into, this solution that's going to lift all the rising boats, a rising tide lifts all boats. That's not the point, because only African Americans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Only African Americans were enslaved. And so when you look at what was done specifically to African Americans, only African Americans were redlined and forbidden from, well, not just only, but Jim Crow.
That wasn't a law. That was some policies of some banks. It was not a law.
Just quickly then, finally, to Anthony, what would you say to those struggling communities in America below the poverty line with rampant crime? If, however it's packaged up, if there was a chance of investment or money coming in to try and get those people out of poverty, you would say no because it looks like a political token.
It's a political game. It won't happen, first of all. It's an empty campaign promise. There are plenty of government programs out there that are given to these low-income communities. They're not used properly. Really what it does, it keeps these communities in a dependent state, and they're never able to get out of it. Like Ms. Everson said, we've been beholden to the Democratic Party for a long time, about 50 years or more, with no positive results. In the year 1960, we had an 80% two-parent household rate. In 1960, during all this racism, segregation, all this and that, now we have nearly a 73% single-parent household rate, and most prison inmates come from a single-parent household. The Great Society, the welfare state, all those things have really ruined us, and more money from the government won't help in fixing that. OK, the only thing it seems to prove is that it's polarising. Anthony, Reese, thanks very much for joining us on RT. Good to have you both on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.